Okay, welcome to our panel, When Revolutions Turn Authoritarian, Pathways from Democratic Ideals to Autocratic Rule. My name is Hannah Barron, and I'm an assistant professor of political science at Xavier University of Louisiana, and I'm also the co-founder of the Democratic Erosion Consortium. The consortium brings together students, scholars, and policymakers to develop evidence and foster critical conversations that help us better understand and respond to democratic backsliding worldwide. The Chicago Center on Democracy, based at the University of Chicago, shares this mission, strengthening democracy through research, dialogue, and community building. We're fortunate to have an outstanding group of panelists today. Our moderator, Professor Becca Hansen, is Associate Professor at the University of Florida with a joint appointment in Sociology and Criminology and Law and the Center for Latin American Studies. Her recent book, Policing the Revolution, examines the transformation of coercive power and Venezuela's security landscape under Chavismo. Professor Colin Beck, political sociologist at Pomona College, is an expert on revolutions and political violence. His current project is a meta-analysis of 5 decades of comparative studies of revolution. Dora Maria Telles is a Nicaraguan historian, politician, and social rights activist. A former Sandinista commander and later Minister of Health, she broke with the Sandinista National Liberation Front in the 1990s over its authoritarian turn and co-founded the Sandinista Renovation Movement, now called UNAMOS. She has since been a leading voice opposing the Ortega dictatorship. Professor David Smiley, chair of sociology at Tulane University, is an authority on Venezuelan politics. His scholarship engages questions of peacemaking, negotiation, and Venezuela's transition to a liberalism. Before we begin, a few quick notes for the audience. Please use the Q&A function to submit questions, and we'll select a few to discuss at the end of the panel. And you can select either the English or Spanish channel. Live interpretation is available. Thank you to Elise here. So at the bottom of your screen, you should see next to show captions or more, or within the more button, an option to listen in English or in Spanish. With that, I'm delighted to turn it over to Professor Becca Hansen.
Great, thank you so much, Hannah. So just to remind our panelists, you'll have about 4 to 5 minutes each to respond to each question. And I'll kind of give you, I'll be tracking and give you a nudge if you start to go a little bit over. So I'll ask our first question, so we can just go ahead and jump into it. So our first question is really thinking about the fact that revolutions, don't really have predetermined outcomes. They're very highly contingent and composed of turning points when things could go one way or another. So I wanted to ask about these moments of possibility and closure. So I'll open it up and maybe ask Colin to start us off.
Sure. Let me just first say I appreciate being here with all these distinguished scholars and activists. It's really an honor to be speaking to all of you today. So I was thinking about this quite a bit, this question. We often talk about there's kind of the noisy phase of revolution, right? There's the emergent phase where it appears that a revolution is potentially imminent. There's the noisy phase as different groups in the state and regime all kind of fight over power. And then there's the kind of the aftermath phase. And I think in general terms, I really like the framework that Eric Selbin has worked with in the past, which is the new regime needs to solve 2 problems. One is the institutionalization of their power. How do they actually set up a minimal new government that is able to function? And then the second is consolidation. How do they win the kind of hearts and minds of the people? How do they empower their society and their citizens and kind of rally people around their new regime? And I think the institutionalization is actually kind of the crux of the turning point in many ways. The key to institutionalizing a new regime is solving the succession problem. What happens when the revolutionary leadership that has seized power passes away or fades from the political scene? What is the kind of mechanism by which power will be transferred to a different set of leaders? And so essentially, this is the problem of personal power. How do you routinize charisma, essentially? And I think this is actually kind of a key turning point for when democracy or autocracy is a potential outcome. As the government, what do they do about the succession problem? And so I'd kind of see a key warning point there as when the regime starts to rely on coercive force alone. So in kind of an ideal typical circumstance, you imagine that they take power either peacefully or through armed struggle. And then after they kind of the noisy phase and they've consolidated some power, how do they actually then maintain their rule? And if they're doing it through coercive force, through setting up a coercive apparatus, through extensive use of power and violence, then that suggests that this is actually something that is veering into autocracy. If they've actually consolidated their win with winning the hearts and minds of society, then they probably don't need to use force. So I kind of think of the issue of, does the new regime use a coercive apparatus against its political opponents, as a kind of a key warning sign of this is going to lead to democratic consolidation or counter-revolution or authoritarian consolidation.
Great, thank you, Colin. Laura Maria?
Muchas gracias, Beca, y muchas gracias a Ana por la organización de este foro y con estas compañías. Yo creo que los puntos que ha planteado Colin son unos puntos realmente torales. Es decir, los cursos de las revoluciones son cursos complejos entre lo que el objetivo al cual pretenden llegar o el objetivo inicial que se han fijado y el curso que van tomando. La revolución sandinista, que yo pues conozco de cerca, tenía en principio una orientación al socialismo. Es decir, era el modelo del Frente Sandinista previo a los últimos años de la crisis de la dictadura. Pero los compromisos inmediatos antes del derrocamiento de la dictadura fueron de pluralismo político y economía mixta. Es decir, este ya era un curso distinto. La revolución sandinista entre 79 y 90 fue transitando en una contradicción permanente entre ambos puntos. Este es un régimen de partido único o va a haber un pluralismo político. Este es un régimen en el cual se va a privilegiar la propiedad estatal o va a existir la propiedad privada con la dinámica habitual, o va a haber un régimen de propiedad cooperativa o de propiedad campesina más amplia. Es decir, son temas que van situando las revoluciones en un curso complejo. Y en el caso de la revolución nicaragüense, como se produce la agresión de los Estados Unidos y la guerra civil, esto la mete en un cauce adicional de autoritarismo creciente. Es decir, el modelo político autoritario que no cuestiona a profundidad se consolida de cara al tema de la necesidad de defender la revolución. Y entonces, pero desemboca en una cosa completamente sorpresiva, que es en la elección de 1990. La elección de 1990 es el fin de la revolución, el fin del periodo revolucionario, abriendo un proceso de transición a la democracia, con la particularidad de que el Frente Sandinista asume esa derrota electoral y el proceso de transición pacífica por primera vez en la historia de Nicaragua, de transmisión de poder, lo asume como un hijo no deseado. Y esto marca también una bifurcación de camino en lo que va a ser el sandinismo después y lo que es el sandinismo hasta 1990.
Gracias. Hannah, do you want to repeat the instructions or put them in the chat? Because it looks like someone's asking for how to do the translation. So I don't know if you want to put that in the chat.
Absolutely. Yes, I'll put that in the chat.
Okay, David?
Yeah, well, thank you. I'd like to first start by thanking Hannah for sort of organizing this, being the motor behind this session, and for Becca for working with her to develop the questions about this. I think the most difficult turning points to reverse are, I think, those moments when leaders become significantly compromised. No, it's when they've effectively raised their exit costs to the point that by relinquishing power, they put themselves significantly at risk. No, so I think Nicolas Maduro could have relinquished power without too many liabilities in 2016, for example. 2016 was after the opposition had won a landslide victory in the National Assembly, and they were pushing for a recall referendum. And the government put all kinds of different obstacles, but they met those obstacles, and they were on the verge of getting that recall referendum, and it was just canceled by through the most specious legal reasoning you can imagine. That was a turning point. Before that, Chavismo during Chavez and Maduro was within the broad gamut of electoral democracy. Many cases, sort of defective elections, but broadly electoral. That was really the first moment that they had canceled an electoral event because they knew they were going to lose. That then led to the following year a push for a constituent assembly, an illegal call, an unconstitutional call for a constituent assembly. They called it without a referendum. They just called it. And that led to a massive sequence of protests that were violently repressed. And so I think that from October to July of October 2016, July 2017, that series of events then just really, I think, made it much more difficult to imagine Chavismo taking a democratic path. In fact, the repression of that period really is sort of the centerpiece of the International Criminal Court case against Maduro. I think we can also think of the 2024 elections of last year, when the opposition behind Maria Corina Machado stormed to an electoral landslide. The Maduro government, in this case, significantly miscalculated. They thought they were going to be able to pull it out, through using their various tricks and abuses that they've learned to do in elections. But they actually lost by a landslide, and they simply faked the totals. I mean, they didn't really even have a very clever plan. They just made up basically on the back of on a napkin the totals that didn't even make sense, and basically said, oh, we don't need to release the tally sheets. The opposition had photos of most of the tally sheets and showed that it had been a rout. But they said, oh, we don't need to release these tally sheets. And so in that case, basically undermining what was one of the biggest contributions of Chavismo, is these transparent elections. And so that, being humiliated nationally and internationally, being significant, being quite vulnerable to prosecution. I mean, I think those are two moments in which it was really hard to reverse the course. I mean, I've always been one of the main things I've always been saying during this time in my sort of efforts to advocate in this conflict is that things can always be reversed. There is no necessary trajectory to events, no teleology. History shows so many times that things have been turned around, but there are certain events that really sort of significantly change the game and make it much less likely that a revolution stays or becomes democratic. And those are two.
Great, thank you. And thank you to our panelists for sticking to your time limit. So we're going to jump into thinking about inflection points, so related to this idea of highly contingent outcomes. So looking across Nicaragua, Venezuela, and other revolutions that you study, there are moments when a democratic path still feels possible, and others when the turn toward authoritarianism seems locked in. So from your perspective, what are the key turning points when the trajectory becomes especially hard to reverse, which I think David has already kind of hinted at a little bit. So let's start with Dora María esta vez.
Bueno, para mí, yo quiero diferenciar aquí entre la revolución sandinista, el periodo entre el 79 y 90, y el curso que sigue el Frente Sandinista posteriormente y que desemboca en la dictadura actual de la familia Ortega Murillo. Y yo siento que ese punto de bifurcación es exactamente el momento posterior a las elecciones de 1990. El Frente Sandinista tiene la opción de asumir como una victoria revolucionaria la transición pacífica de poder de una fuerza política a otra, que es un hecho inédito en Nicaragua. Sin embargo, él lo asume, pero lo asume con un conflicto. Lo asume como una derrota que no debe volverse a producir bajo ningún concepto y que en cualquier regreso al poder esa derrota no va a volverse a repetir. Es decir, lejos de adoptar el camino de la democratización del sandinismo, comenzando por su democratización interna y un compromiso democrático a profundidad, el camino que se escoge es el camino de ir desarrollando los cauces autoritarios primero dentro del partido, que después llegaron a volcarse en la sociedad nicaragüense con esta nueva con esta nueva dictadura. Es ahí el momento en el que podía haber cambiado, digamos, en que el sandinismo podía haberse enrumbado con un compromiso democrático sólido y no seguir el cauce que ha desembocado pues en este régimen represivo de los Ortega Murillo.
Gracias. Colin, would you like to go next?
Sure. Yeah, I'm thinking about this kind of in comparative perspective, and thinking particularly about the Arab uprisings and the varied outcomes that we have seen with those. And it seems to me that a kind of key inflection for the Arab uprisings was moments of counter-revolution, and what happened with elites, right? Are elites incorporated into the new regime, the prior elites? Are they able to kind of take over the regime to some degree? Or are they excluded from the new regime? And it kind of seems to me that what happens with the former elites is very key, right? You bring them in, there's the danger that they can overthrow the revolution, essentially institute a new form of autocracy, as we saw in Egypt. But if you don't bring them in, then you actually kind of leave a countervailing force in society that then potentially creates a threat to the revolutionary regime. And that potentially leads to a turn towards authoritarianism, right? To hold on to power. I think David said it really well. When the leaders have the exit costs are too high for them to step down in power, then that suggests you're on the path to authoritarianism rather than democratic consolidation. So it isn't one particular event. It's just, to me, it's kind of like a diagnostic test of what is going on, how pluralistic is the new regime, what is it doing with its former political enemies, how is it incorporating them, not incorporating them, where do they kind of end up in the new post-revolution order?
Great. Thank you, David.
Okay, so my apologies. I sort of answered this question in my first comments, but let me just add to it. I think, add to the other side. Looking at sort of opposition strategy. I think there's a couple moments in which that has had a really big impact. And one of the things, just parentheses, one of the things that we're doing in looking at Venezuela in terms of sort of the literature on revolution is really trying to include it as a conflict, as a conflict with two sides. And it's not just revolution and counter-revolution, but the opposition itself has its own characteristics, its own history, and that's really important to take into account. So we're seeing it more as sort of a relational field. I think the coup, the April 11, 2002 coup, was underdetermined. It was a strategy that was taken by some opposition leaders, and that it did not succeed. And that had a huge imprint. That had a big imprint on the direction of Chavismo after that. It was already, taking sort of an authoritarian track, but then that just allowed it to sort of create. That was, I have a little hat in my office that says every 11th has a 13th. And that was just like their call to arms or the justification still to this day. And so that just, I think really pushed Chavismo in a more authoritarian direction, which is not to excuse that authoritarian direction, but to say that this is a relational context. I think, more recently, just last year, for the last 2 years, Maria Corina Machado became the sort of undisputed leader. And, she took an electoral path, which has not always been the center of her political strategy. She took an electoral path, but with a discourse that was very sort of intolerant, very much sort of suggested those that didn't support her were not Venezuelan. And, it was a very divisive discourse. Now, she generated an electoral path or generated a movement that brought Edmundo Gonzalez to win that election. He should be president right now. However, it strongly imprints what happens after that. Now we have an opposition which has its undisputed leader, someone who is against negotiations, against dialogue, has an intolerant discourse. And there's really, I see no way that this can lead to democracy. There's just no way that that's going to lead to Chavismo say, oh, okay, you can have power. It's just not going to happen. And so That's also a key turning point. You can imagine if that same movement had happened, but with somebody with a different rhetoric, with Capriles, a Henry Falcón, you can imagine any number of other people that have a more moderate discourse, could they have generated the emotion? Could they have generated the mobilization that Maria Corina? There's a big question there, but it would have left them in a different place. Now I really think they're in sort of a dead end. And I think, that is the reason that their main focus now has been on international intervention, because there is no way forward for that movement, I think, within Venezuela right now.
Great. Thank you, David. So now we're going to turn to thinking about dynamics of revolutionary transitions, especially the role of violence and elections and the way that leaders come to power. So the first question is, many historical revolutions were born in armed struggle. Do the methods used to seize power, especially the role of violence, leave a lasting imprint on whether post-revolutionary politics lean toward democracy or lean toward authoritarianism? And David, we'll start with you this time.
Okay. Yeah. So I think definitely sort of the way revolutions come to power has an important imprint. And I think Steve Levitsky and Lucan Way, their book on violent revolutions, how they almost always become authoritarian, I think is indicative of that. I think Venezuela is an interesting case because it shows that there's more involved. I think Venezuela is what we would call an electoral revolution. Both Chavez and Maduro achieved power democratically through elections that were not perfect, of course, but were certainly within the realm of acceptability. However, they both had this revolutionary discourse, promising a radical change, and they both clearly used state institutions to harass the opposition and marginalize it from the levers of power. So, given that, in the end, state power, given that, if we think about state power as, in the end, sort of based on the privileged control of the means of violence, this can be seen as a violent exercise of revolutionary power. Now, one of the things I really like about the book that Colin published with his colleagues called On Revolutions is that they sort of break down, it's been a whole chapter breaking down, unpacking the idea of violent versus non-violent revolutions, pointing out that there can be quite a variety of mixes. In the case of Venezuela, you have what was originally an electoral revolution that then becomes progressively more violent. First into sort of the abuse of state power. Then in the use of sort of legal institutions to sort of harass opposition politicians. Then, as using police forces to repress protesters and colectivos and repress protesters, to the point that now it's really just hard, for the opposition to have, in Caracas especially, to have any kind of rallies or field mobilization, because they will be attacked by armed parallel state actors. And so this is a revolution that started as democratic, but now has become a violent revolution. So in other words, where things start doesn't mean everything. You would think, oh, it starts democratic, well, then it's going to stay democratic. Well, that's not actually what has happened, because there's other things involved, which I'll talk about a little bit later. The sort of illiberal discourse, the revolutionary discourse, their sort of class analysis that led them into a more authoritarian track.
Thank you. Dora María.
Bueno, indudablemente que las revoluciones cuando ocurren por la vía armada tienen un peso importante de inclinación al autoritarismo. Es decir, la revolución armada requiere una organización que opere con una lógica militar o cuasi militar. No estamos hablando de organizaciones que funcionan como organizaciones políticas democráticas donde hay debate, donde hay lucha política, donde hay, digamos, otra textura organizativa. Estamos hablando de organizaciones que se estructuran sobre una línea de comando militar, como lo fue el Frente Sandinista. Entonces, la tendencia natural de este tipo de organizaciones es un ejercicio de poder de ordeno y mando, autoritario, ¿verdad? Si no hay un proceso crítico del sistema político, y en el sandinismo no hubo un proceso crítico del sistema político previo, pues la tendencia natural que se desarrolla es la tendencia autoritaria. Y en el Frente Sandinista se prolongó, es decir, en el año 2006 que Ortega vuelve al poder, en unas elecciones cuestionadas, vuelve al poder por la vía electoral. Pero ya no se trata como en una revolución armada de ceder el poder mediante una elección. Ahora se trata de cooptar el poder desde una elección. Es decir, desde el posicionamiento electoral va cooptando el poder, ¿verdad? Poco a poco todas las instituciones, incluyendo las Fuerzas Armadas. Y esto va siendo acompañado pues de una lógica de actuación populista que le garantice construir una base social que no tenía. A diferencia de Venezuela, donde Chávez ganaba elecciones con mayoría, Ortega nunca ha podido ganar una elección con mayoría desde el 2006 en adelante. De manera que el imperativo para mantenerse en el poder es la cooptación institucional, incluyendo lógicamente como elemento central las Fuerzas Armadas. Entonces sí, hay una beta autoritaria que parte desde la configuración misma del Frente Sandinista como una organización armada y una organización prácticamente militar, ¿no?
Gracias, súper interesante. Colin?
Yeah, I think my fellow panelists are absolutely right. Like it's very clear that armed struggle kind of would lead to a new revolutionary regime to potentially lean towards authoritarianism. And so we kind of need to maybe complicate the unarmed struggle, right? I think there's an assumption that unarmed people power movements are always democratic. And as the case of Venezuela shows, right, this is not necessarily going to be the case in every country, right? You can win an election and then you can harness state power in violent ways. You know, one of the fundamental dilemmas of a post-revolutionary regime is how do you protect the regime from threats, right? No matter how you came to power. And I think Killian Clark's work has shown fairly persuasively to me that if you do not actually have some sort of armed wing or are able to harness coercive power, that those new regimes, whether they're democratic or not, are actually really fragile. They're exposed to counter-revolution, they're exposed to international intervention. And this historically is actually, you know, the case ever since the French Revolution, right? If we think of the French Revolution as basically an unarmed struggle in many ways that then has to form a coercive apparatus to fight the French Civil Wars and then the French Wars of Expansion, and that gets entirely co-opted by Napoleon, right, later on. And this is also the case in Iran, right? You have essentially a people power revolution that in many ways is an unarmed struggle against the Shah, and then the more violent factions are able to kind of co-opt that revolution fairly quickly and consolidate power. So, you know, it's not an unarmed versus armed distinction, I think. We know that violence kind of potentially leads to more authoritarianism, but just because you came to power in an unarmed way doesn't mean that you're going to end up as a democratic state and society after the revolution, the dust is settled.
Right. And I think we've already kind of been taking a comparative look here, but we're going to go to a specifically comparative question. So kind of stepping back and looking across cases, thinking about where patterns hold and where they might diverge, you know, which comparisons are useful and which might obscure on the ground particularities. That are really key to understanding how a revolution plays out. So really looking across Nicaragua, Venezuela, and other revolutions you study, certain dynamics obviously resonate across cases, which some of you have already mentioned, others not at all. So what do you see as meaningful parallels across these cases, and where do the similarities break down? Comencemos con Dora María.
Bueno, es una pregunta compleja, es decir, tal vez vale la pena remontarse un poco a las causales de los movimientos revolucionarios, como el caso de la Revolución Sandinista del 79, que es una gran oleada de energía que tiene que ver con básicamente dos cosas: la opresión dictatorial de la familia Somoza, de la dictadura de la familia Somoza, y por otro lado la condición de pobreza, de inequidad, de marginación y de discriminación que padecía la mayoría de la sociedad nicaragüense. Si eso hay un momento que eso llega a un tope, como dice Colin correctamente, cuando el uso de la represión es un uso desmedido, hay un momento en que eso provoca un desborde, y ese desborde tiene un potencial revolucionario y se encausa una parte de las veces como una revolución. Esto no es necesariamente comparable con los fenómenos electorales, pero sí tiene alguna base que sí es de similitudes. En los fenómenos electorales que dan lugar a regímenes autoritarios, como puede ser el de Maduro o el de Ortega en Nicaragua, que yo no califico ni siquiera como regímenes revolucionarios ni de izquierda, son unos regímenes autoritarios, pues. Este tipo de modelo tiene que ver también con la condición de la gente que sufre estas mismas inequidades, desigualdades y discriminación, y que busca soluciones muchas veces que se encausan en regímenes autoritarios que trabajan con populismo y en donde la gente cede libertad a cambio de seguridad, a cambio de un poquito de atención, a cambio de un programa social, ¿verdad? Bueno, el caso de El Salvador es un caso crítico. Este es, digamos, la mayoría salvadoreña cediendo a una persona poderes dictatoriales a cambio de seguridad, ¿verdad? Es decir, son procesos complejos, pero tienen que ver en el fondo con las condiciones en las que se encuentran las sociedades. Es decir, los problemas que tienen las sociedades que no son resueltos, en algunos casos por regímenes democráticos, ¿verdad? Y en otros casos por regímenes dictatoriales. Entonces hay o procesos violentos de enorme concentración de energía y fuerza, como las revoluciones, digamos el caso de la Revolución Sandinista en 1979, o procesos masivos de respaldo a figuras claramente autoritarias, ¿verdad? Donde la gente encarna el deseo, la necesidad de que haya una solución a sus problemas que no han sido resueltos en un modelo de democracia electoral, ¿no?
Gracias. Let's see, Colin, can we go to you next?
Yeah, I think Donna Maria is correct. It's very difficult to know. There, in the study of revolution, those of us who spend a lot of time thinking about a variety of cases across time and space, there's been a big conflation of the causes of the structural causes of the revolution and then its eventual outcome. And thinking that the causes of what triggered it are actually, also predict that outcome. And I don't think that's the case at all, that we actually really need to separate out where it ends up, where it shakes out 10, 20, 30 years later, versus how it started. And I think in many ways, there isn't really a pattern that I've been able to discern on that aftermath. Because it's really difficult problem to study. How do you actually, when do you decide to stop counting? When is the revolution over? Is it over when, people are no longer in the street? Is it over when there's a succession of power to a different set of leaders? Who knows? Jack Goldstone once lovely pointed out that depending on how you count, the French Revolution may not have ended until 1945, and the establishment of the Fourth French Republic. So I don't, I see that there's a lot of parallels and causes. I think we have a really good sense of when revolutions are most likely to break out. I don't think we have a very good sense of how they're going to end up in the long run.
Thank you. David?
Okay, so I was thinking here this question about comparative cases and whatnot, and trying to think about Venezuela. I think there's many different types of revolution and outcomes, and I think of Venezuela. Venezuela, what makes it interesting is that it has a configuration that's particular, but it's made up of elements that are not really all that unique. I think on the one hand, as I've mentioned before, it was an electoral revolution. It was a type of revolution that occurs in stalled democracies like Ukraine in 2006. Chávez came to power through elections in a time that, in a context of quite significantly restricted democracy, a democracy that was expanding, but was still quite restricted. He was, in fact, able to expand the power and the scope of elections, at least in the early years. In the 1999 Constitution as well, he expanded the participatory elements, but he also conserved all the existing elements of representative democracy and also expanded them. So there's that, an electoral revolution, and we've seen that in other places. But on the other hand, from the beginning, it also had, Chavez also had a left populist discourse, with strong illiberal elements Chavez presented himself as sort of the synonym of the will of the people, and any restrictions on his rule were considered vestiges of the what he would call the Cuarta República, the Fourth Republic, which was the previous democratic regime. In fact, his discourse is actually quite similar to what we see right now with Donald Trump. Donald Trump basically calls the deep state, what he calls the deep state is essentially sort of liberal limits on executive power. And the idea of him and his people in his coalition are that Trump was elected, so judges and bureaucracies that impede what he wants to do are somehow anti-democratic. Chavez, did the same thing. He referred to them as a state within a state, as a masquerade or a burguesía disfrazada, how would you say that? A closet bourgeoisie that was trying to impede what the people wanted. So these two elements, I think coexisted in uneasy tension. As long as Chavez was popular, and he was popular until he died. After 2015, when the government gets trounced in the National Assembly elections and sort of feared they would never win an election again, the illiberal elements definitely sort of gained the upper hand the executive ended up gaining control over all the branches of the government, including the electoral authority. So I think in some senses, I think Chavismo could have started as an electoral revolution that could have been an expansion of liberalism. I think that was the hope of many people, perhaps most people, when they supported Chavez and voted for Chavez, is they thought this was going to be, a democratic opening, a deeper, richer democracy. And this has happened in other electoral revolutions. But I think, over time, the left populist elements led to this process of democratic erosion that would end up leaving Venezuela looking much more like Cuba or looking like contemporary Nicaragua than any type of deepened democracy.
Thanks, David. So now we're going to turn to thinking about agency and resistance, since there are always actors, even when a government has consolidated its control, there are, of course, always actors that are pushing back, sometimes from inside the system, sometimes from outside. So thinking about once authoritarian consolidation begins, dissidents really have to identify and pursue strategies to survive and resist. So in your research or lived experience, what strategies have proven most effective in this way? What are the limitations of these most effective strategies? And are there strategies that you think should be avoided? Let's start with Colin this time.
Yeah, I think the number one strategy is the need for dissidents, oppositions to kind of cultivate dual power. And I don't mean this in the Trotskyist sense, right? Of like you create parallel institutions to the state and your own violent wings. You basically need to dig in to your mobilizing organizations, to what we call civil society, essentially. The deeper and the more extensive you organize and mobilize at a grassroots level, the stronger your power will be in contending with creeping authoritarianism. That seems to be kind of the message across many cases, particularly, right? We can think of solidarity and in Poland and how effective that was in the long run, and how effective I think actually the organization and mobilization in Iran will eventually be, not in the near horizon, but eventually I think it'll show its power. Two things don't really seem to work anymore. One is like the boomerang model of activism, right? Of Keck and Sakek, like you organize locally to grab international attention, so international actors can put attention on a bad regime, and that causes it to fall. And I think for whatever reason, the boomerang model is really breaking down in the 21st century in this kind of age of authoritarianism and counter-revolution. The other, so kind of like exile and diaspora organizing doesn't seem to be as effective as it once was. The other thing that I would say almost unequivocally, is if you're in a political opposition, boycotting elections does not work. Every time you boycott, you're basically just ceding the political power, the political field to those who are in power. So that would be my number one advice to anyone who is thinking of being a dissident. Just don't boycott, contend where you can everywhere.
Great, thank you. David?
Okay, thank you. And thank you, Colin, for that. And just so that my Venezuela colleagues and critics know, Colin and I have not spoken before this. that was purely autochthonous from Colin and his research, not on Venezuela, but in other contexts. I think, for me, and this has been my long-term struggle in Venezuela, my long-term point of advocacy, is that I think internal opposition is the most effective route. I think, electoral politics based on actual field work and organization and street mobilization is the way to go. And I think this has been a central problem of Venezuela's political elite virtually since the 19th century. Of course, there have been plenty of exceptions, but in general, there's been this tendency among Venezuela's traditional political elite to see themselves as working for the people, but not with them, or really even in consultation with them. I think this comes from sort of 19th century notion that the people are not civilized enough to actually know what they need, and so leaders know what is right for them. Venezuelan people are quite different than they were 100 years ago or 50 years ago, and want a tighter engagement with politicians who actually are going to represent them. And so this is one of the reasons that Chavismo sort of ran circles around the opposition for so many years, is that the opposition just never had this engagement with the population, always overestimated how sort of inherently compelling they were, and just didn't do the field work to really build up their base. Now, of course, this is totally exacerbated because the government complicates, often violently, efforts at field work and community organizing. It has the power to sort of do that and even complicate the sort of the long-term tendencies of the opposition in itself. And so, but nevertheless, I mean, even through so many things, the opposition, there are ways of consulting and really doing what the people want, engaging the people so much more than they're doing. And they've oftentimes just gone and supported policies that are very unpopular, like U.S. sanctions, or hoping for some sort of salvation from foreign intervention is what we're seeing right now. That has been the past year. That has been the centerpiece of Maria Corina Machado's efforts, is trying to generate U.S. intervention through stories of the Tren de Aragua being controlled by Nicolas Maduro. Cartel, the Cartel de los Soles, as this drug cartel, which is also a fiction. So that's one. Excuse me. The other is, yes, as Colin mentioned, I mean, what not to do, don't boycott elections. And I think, if we look at our current world, the authoritarian context that we have now, many or most of them are populist, and populists generally depend on maintaining the idea that they are popular. They like elections. They usually want to have elections, and that is the key vulnerability. That is the trap door. That is the one space to get in, because sometimes now Chavismo controls basically all the powers, but they have to go to elections. And so giving that up and basically boycotting elections, thinking that that's going to generate international opposition or something else, is just really, really a serious mistake that we've seen time and again the Venezuelan opposition take. It's just a misreading, I think, of history.
Great, thanks, David. Dora María.
Estoy de acuerdo con David y Colin. Es decir, frente a un régimen autoritario como el de Ortega, pues, o como el de Maduro en Venezuela, el de Ortega en Nicaragua, el primer tema, creo yo, que corresponde a la oposición es disputar la base social. Eso es fundamental. Es decir, la disputa de la base social, la disputa del pueblo, la disputa del respaldo popular es absolutamente esencial para cualquier intento de encauzar el sistema político hacia la democracia. Sin eso, cualquier esfuerzo se convierte en un esfuerzo de élite que no va a cuajar apropiadamente. Ahora, tenemos que reconocer que aquí estamos en una circunstancia sumamente compleja. Como decía Colin, cuando estos regímenes sienten de que las elecciones ponen en riesgo el poder, de que el costo de una elección puede ser mayor, el costo de la pérdida del poder puede ser elevado, pues simplemente dejan de estar dispuestos a hacer elecciones limpias. Es decir, Ortega en el año 2021 pues nos encarceló a todos los que supuso como liderazgo opositor, nos metió a la cárcel, eliminó todos los partidos políticos y fue solo en la boleta electoral. Y bueno, como decía David, Maduro en Venezuela, frente a las últimas elecciones nacionales, pues terminaron en una circunstancia de fraude ostensible y claro, ¿verdad? Y no se dieron el poder. Entonces ahí tenemos ya un primer problema. La lucha política efectivamente tiene que apuntar al desenlace del régimen por la vía electoral, al cambio del régimen por la vía electoral. No hay otra manera, a menos que hablemos de lucha armada y ese es otro capítulo. Pero si la vía electoral está cerrada, entonces la gran pregunta que se hace en los movimientos opositores es, ¿cuál es el camino? ¿Verdad? Lo segundo es que el escenario internacional actual favorece los regímenes autoritarios. Lo favorece porque hay una tendencia, no solamente en los Estados Unidos, de aislacionismo, sino una tendencia mundial de aislacionismo. Nadie está preocupado por el autoritario que tiene en el vecindario si no le molesta. Es decir, problemas como los de la Organización de Estados Americanos, por ejemplo, que está en condición de colapso, ¿verdad? Con la Carta Democrática absolutamente guardada en un cajón, nos demuestra de que el escenario internacional que está ausente y que en una época tuvo un papel relevantísimo en la presión para buscar la transición de los regímenes dictatoriales, como fue, por ejemplo, la época del presidente Carter. La gestión activa del presidente Jimmy Carter a favor de los derechos humanos contribuyó decisivamente y la OEA contribuyó decisivamente al desenlace de la dictadura de los Somoza a la revolución sandinista. Pero ese escenario internacional ahora es un escenario diferente. Y yo diría que es un escenario que no es favorable. El tercer punto, y yo coincido con David, es que es un error esperar que fuerzas extranjeras resuelvan el problema de un país. Eso pues, erróneo y además probablemente extemporáneo porque nadie está dispuesto a resolverlo. Nadie está pues, haciendo fila para resolver el problema de Venezuela, ni nadie está haciendo fila para resolver el problema de Nicaragua. Al final, la solución del problema descansa en los cambios en la correlación de fuerzas internas. Y un último punto, que es el tema del debilitamiento de los pilares de poder de estos regímenes. Ellos se sostienen en la fuerza de la represión, en la fuerza de las armas y en la coacción que ejercen sobre los empleados públicos. Entonces, ese trabajo de debilitamiento de los pilares de poder a mí me parece que es un trabajo fundamental a realizar si queremos lograr una evolución, ¿verdad? Por la vía política, por la lucha política, por la vía electoral de regímenes democráticos a una transición, de regímenes autoritarios a una transición hacia la democracia.
Sorry, I was muted. We have one or two more questions left. We'll see which ones we can get to before Q&A. So thinking about the cases you study, how has revolution been remembered and memorialized? What current struggles are taking place over the historical narrative of the revolution? And how does controlling the narrative help entrench authoritarianism and how it might be reclaimed for democratic renewal? David?
Okay. Yeah. So, I mean, I think Venezuela is a case in which the government has expended extraordinary resources on narrating, its ascension to power and its exercising power. It's used from the beginning the idea of revolution as this heroic struggle of the Venezuelan people against a conspiring elite. No, so it's narrated this with monuments, with television stations, with everything possible, I think. And of course, that is part of their power. That narration, that continual drumbeat of narration, has been a huge part of their power. I think the more interesting question is this: what opportunities there are for democratic renewal? I mean, I think within Chavismo, there's huge opportunities. I mean, I think you can imagine a movement within Chavismo, in which certain elements, for example, Chavez was the one that originally reinforced this electronic electoral system, this very transparent, very solid system that was solid enough to show that they had committed fraud. He also won elections by large margins. He won most of the elections in 20 some elections, he won most of them. And so that is something that could really be narrated as this expansion of democracy. He also presided over significant decreases in poverty and inequality. This is you can very seriously criticize them for not being sustainable. No, I think that is evident from the beginning. But all of that could be weaved into a narrative of democratic restoration among, I think, the governing coalition. I think, on the other side, despite my many and frequent criticisms of it, the opposition has fought, over time has fought the good fight. I think they've tried virtually everything. They've gone to many elections. They've boycotted some, but they've gone to many elections. They've gone to international institutions. They've protested in the streets. They've documented human rights violations. They've gone to the ICC. They've written about what's happened. They themselves have narrated, and scholars and analysts have narrated what has happened. I think all of that could be woven into a heroic narrative of the rescue of democracy. I think Maria Corina Machado, that's what she spends a lot of her time as well, is narrating this heroic return to democracy. I mean, the real challenge is how do you combine these narratives? I think in contemporary Venezuela, polarization is not really the right term because it's not like you have equal blocks that are, completely interpreting things differently. But polarization of the public sphere, I think, is a thing in that, the government has this preeminence within the country to be able to get its message out. Opposition has this preeminence outside of Venezuela, and they're really just completely different discourses that don't overlap. I think, so that's one key task, which some of us have advocated for, in the various sort of negotiation processes that have happened. They haven't gotten this far, but it's been really key, to it. We have said it would be key because I don't think any of this ever happened to actually be able for them to be able to narrate. I mean, I think at one time in August of 2021, they came together with one document, the opposition and Chavismo. And I know that the Norwegian mediators were very happy about that and saw that as the beginning of a narration of this sort of new configuration, but it didn't get any further than that. So that is the real challenge. You can imagine these two narratives on each side, but how they combine it is, I think, almost no work has been done on that so far.
Gracias, David. Dora María.
Bueno, la narrativa yo creo que es uno de los elementos centrales de los regímenes autoritarios, ¿verdad? Es decir, en el caso de Nicaragua, la narrativa actual del régimen de los Ortega tiene varias guías, ¿no? Una primera que es el anclaje de la memoria heroica de la Revolución Sandinista, de la lucha contra la dictadura de Somoza y posterior. En una época desapareció todo el culto a los combatientes caídos y se estableció nada más el culto a la familia Ortega Murillo, a Rosario Murillo y a Daniel Ortega. Pero de un tiempo para acá han vuelto a necesitar, ¿verdad?, remojar toda la parte heroica de la lucha contra la dictadura de los Somoza para legitimarse frente a su propia base social que ha ido en disminución. La segunda guía que es interesante es el fenómeno de la adopción de un lenguaje religioso, espiritualista, digamos, por parte de los Ortega Murillo, como una especie de cemento ideológico de su propia fuerza dentro del sandinismo. Es decir, hablan en los cambios constitucionales que han hecho, hablan de una revolución cristiana, socialista y solidaria. Es decir, se asume desde una guía vinculada al cristianismo y ellos se establecen como una pareja predestinada por Dios y además con la vinculación, digamos, a la narrativa heroica de la lucha sandinista. Y un tercer elemento que sucede, creo yo, también en Venezuela, que es el estímulo de la polarización. El lenguaje es un lenguaje revolucionarista, ¿verdad? De apariencia revolucionaria y un lenguaje que tiende a polarizar, a hablar del antiimperialismo para cohesionar su base social y a polarizar sandinismo y antisandinismo para evitar que una parte del sandinismo se vuelque también en el movimiento opositor, es decir, para evitar seguir perdiendo base social. Del lado de la narrativa opositora, el problema es, pues, es un dilema porque la narrativa opositora tiene que ser, en efecto, una narrativa afirmativa y de esperanza, pero aquí hay ya un momento crítico cuando hay una parte de la oposición que adopta todo el lenguaje y el discurso del trumpismo, ¿verdad? Como una cosa que se puede trasladar a la lucha contra el régimen autoritario de los Ortega en Nicaragua. Entonces hay ahí, y también cae en la polarización sandinismo-antisandinismo, que enajena a una parte de la oposición, pues de una parte de la base social que tiene que ganarse necesariamente para enfrentar al régimen autoritario. Es decir, la disputa de narrativa es, por un lado, pues hay un conflicto y por otro lado hay que crear una narrativa opositora. Y yo creo que en el caso de Venezuela, el éxito de María Corina en los últimos tiempos ha sido exactamente eso, ¿verdad? Presentar unas luchas claras, unos mojones claros a los cuales llegar como oposición y poder construir esa narrativa que sea una narrativa movilizadora. Yo siento que ahí tenemos todavía un déficit en Nicaragua.
Colin?
Yeah, I think, like it or not, we are still in the global populist moment, right? And power is, particularly of creeping authoritarians, is dependent on putting themselves forward as symbols of the people, and the people need a national myth. And so nationalism and patriotism are like really powerful narratives and symbols, for those who want to consolidate their power. And I think the hope question, as David pointed out, is actually the most interesting one of like, what can you actually do with that? And I think it's a mistake for oppositions to kind of seed the narrative about what the nation is, or how the nation came to be, or how the revolution occurred, to the opposition, right? Case in point is Ukraine. They've done a really good job of memorializing 2004 and 2014 as these kind of foundational moments for Ukraine's sense of identity. And I think that goes a long way to explaining their tenacity in the face of the Russian invasion. Um, so essentially, I think too, like what we see in the US is that the American left has essentially ceded the American narrative and American nationalism to the right, the political right. And I think that's very much a mistake. The "Don't Tread on Me" flag should actually belong to the Democratic Party, and not right-wing, gun-toting Americans. And, basically this may sound trite, but essentially you want to have 1,000 performances of Hamilton the musical everywhere, right? Like retelling the story of America's revolutionary founding with the people who are actually American today. And so, you need to be able to contend with nationalism, with patriotism, with a narrative that actually allows people to see themselves in your politics.
Hey, thank you. So I think, probably saved the hardest question for last. Kind of looking forward to the possibilities that today's movements in revolutionary or authoritarian context face. Of course, history offers plenty of cautionary tales, but there are also examples of revolutions that sustained or deepened democracy, maybe at different times, some more than others. Is there anything about the cases you study that gives you hope that revolutions can produce positive legacies? And I would like to start with Dora Maria on this one.
Bueno, yo creo que hay legados positivos. Pues yo siento que la revolución sandinista entre el 79 y el 90 produjo uno de los legados, dos por lo menos cruciales en Nicaragua. Produjo la constitución más generosa en materia de reconocimiento de derechos políticos, económicos y sociales para los nicaragüenses. Es decir, es una constitución absolutamente revolucionaria en materia de derechos, en materia de los temas de igualdad de las mujeres, en materia de los temas de no discriminación. Es decir, es para los derechos sociales, los derechos laborales. Es una constitución que, por un lado, en el sistema político era autoritaria, y todo el resto de derechos pues era total y absolutamente revolucionaria. Es decir, los derechos a las autonomías de los pueblos indígenas, el derecho a sus tierras ancestrales, son temas que son legados fundamentales y que precisamente están ahora en disputa con el régimen de los Ortega Murillo. Hace unos días publicaron una ley, aprobaron una ley que confisca una parte de las tierras indígenas del sur y del norte de Nicaragua. Esto sí lesiona este mismo legado de la revolución sandinista de conceder y reconocer el derecho de los indígenas a su propio territorio y de la ley 445 aprobada en la década de los 90 que establecía la delimitación y la demarcación y titulación de estos territorios como en efecto se hizo. Entonces aquí tenemos un régimen autoritario que se ha estado comiendo el legado mismo de la revolución mientras sostiene una narrativa revolucionarista. Es decir, se come el legado de la revolución porque todos los derechos han quedado liquidados. Es decir, todo lo que, y aquí es muy importante eso que decía David, todo el proceso de participación, organización, el auge de organización popular en Nicaragua, que fue enorme en la década de los 80 y que se convirtió, digamos, en una multiplicidad de organizaciones de la sociedad civil y organizaciones de trabajadores, campesinos, etcétera, ha sido absolutamente liquidado. Al día de hoy no hay una sola organización de la sociedad civil que esté legal en el país. Todo ha sido completamente destruido en el ánimo del régimen de Ortega de destruir las redes sociales, que fueron justamente las que crecieron durante y las que explotaron, digamos, como una explosión de participación durante la época de la Revolución Sandinista. Entonces, ese es probablemente yo que para mí es de los legados fundamentales. El segundo era el que ya decía, pues la revolución sandinista desemboca en una elección, el Frente Sandinista pierde, reconoce la derrota electoral, hace una transición pacífica del poder. Eso es efectivamente un legado que también ha sido liquidado por el régimen de los Ortega Murillo, es decir, por un Frente Sandinista que llegó a la convicción de que una vez en el poder no lo va a abandonar de ninguna manera. Y el tercero, que pues se deterioró, es todo lo relativo a la reforma agraria. Sí, la reforma agraria y la reforma urbana significó una distribución de tierra que dio una oportunidad al campesinado pobre en Nicaragua, y la reforma urbana que convirtió al 80% de las personas dentro de la ciudad en propietarios de su propia vivienda o de su propio lote. Esto yo creo que son legados esenciales. Yo no meto en la factura la construcción del ejército que había evolucionado como ejército nacional y que volvió a convertirse en un ejército ya no de un partido político, sino subordinado a la familia en el poder. Pero sí, las revoluciones en medio de sus procesos contradictorios, difíciles, tienen efectivamente legados relevantes.
Gracias. David?
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think I think Venezuela is sort of a good bad example. I think it's an example of how a revolution can go wrong. I think you know, uh, I think revolutions have an inherent risk of becoming authoritarian. No, revolutions generally succeed when they start with large majorities behind them, but liberal institutions, are essentially aimed at limiting the power of majorities, limiting the power of governments. Liberal institutions, separation of powers, autonomous bureaucracies, civil political rights, they inevitably slow down change, which requires, change requires political power to overcome resistance. So, and I think this is not just revolutionary delirium. No, this idea, oh, we have to have power to change. No, I think political scientists like Alfred Steppen and Juan Lintz, have analyzed years ago, veto stops, basically showing that the more veto stops, in other words, the more places that a popular legislation, say starting in the National Assembly or in our House of Representatives, the more places it has to die. For example, in the U.S., it's You know, it has to go to the Senate, then to the presidency, then can go to Supreme Court. The more veto stops a democracy has, the more inequality it has. And so it's clear that, you know, liberal institutions, you know, they can restrict majorities, often as they prevent needed change. And so revolutionaries are not crazy in thinking that. But of course, you know, that means that oftentimes they can end up abusing that. No, I mean, I do not think that, you know, I think this is a tendency in revolution. It's a constant danger in any process that's considered revolutionary. Uh, you know, but I think it is possible. It is possible to even talk about revolution all while adopting a pluralist discourse, you know, saying, you know, acknowledging that at some point in the future you might not be in power, you know, giving space to the opposition. You know, I think this could have happened in Venezuela at several points in time, but it did not. No, in 2013, 2016, 2024, in each case, a sort of illiberal discourse of, you know, us being the synonym of the revolution that's irreversible, you know, prevailed over, you know, acknowledgement of pluralism. I think, you know, I think Venezuela, you know, I don't think that, you know, revolutions are inherently bad or wrong. I think they actually can go right. And I think that sometimes it's the only way. I mean, I think Nicaragua in 1979 that was probably the only way that change could have happened. You know, I can't imagine an electoral solution to that. I think Venezuela in 1998, I don't think that it actually needed a revolution. I think there was actually progress being made, you know, in the economy and in the state, in the democracy throughout that decade that could have, I think we probably had a better course of events if that had continued on. No. So I think there are moments that revolution is really indispensable, moments that it's probably not the best way of thinking about social and political change. I think it has inherent um, dangers to it, but inherent powers also. It's a way that real inequalities and injustices can be overcome in some contexts.
David, Colin?
Yeah, I think, you know, on the world historical balance, revolutions are a force for good. You know, if we think of the advancement of democracy and civil and political liberties, that was accomplished by the liberal Enlightenment revolutions of the 19th century. If we think of the institutionalization of human rights and attention to inequality, right, this is a product of decolonial movements across the world in the 20th century. You know, and I think so on balance, revolutions are a force for good. However, it's really dependent on world historical time. You know, if you have a revolution that occurs in a world context that would kind of nudge you towards good outcomes, however we would want to define good, then you're more likely to get good outcomes. So if we think of like the legacies of revolutions and people power movements in Brazil and South Korea, they've done a really good job of negotiating authoritarianism. Well, maybe not a really good job, but a better job than most because they have this positive legacy of their democratic revolutions. And they kind of built it into their institutions to help protect the state and the regime and the people from the emergence of new authoritarianism. But that took place in a context that was permissive of that. So I'm actually going to end not with hope, but pessimism. I always tell my students I'm pessimistic by nature and training because I'm a sociologist. But we're not in a world context, in like world historical time context, that would nudge revolutions to being a force for good. And so I think in the near term, I'm thinking in the next 20 or 30 years, like what we'll actually kind of see is revolutions not actually institutionalizing human rights, not actually promoting social equality, but actually eroding that around the world.
Thanks, Colin. So we have a few minutes for questions from the audience. I'm going to read some of these off, and rather than calling on people, I'll just let anyone who feels like they would like to respond to the question. There is at least one question that's particular to Venezuela, but anyone jump in on that question as well. So let's start off with this question about, so it often seems that revolutions are fueled by cycles of violence, where those who seize power through violent struggle feel entitled to hold on to it. how can we build political movements that not only overthrow dictatorships like in Nicaragua, but also provide a genuine bridge to democracy? And what might transitional justice look like in the current cases that you study or work on?
Well, I'll just jump in and I'll say, I think the South African case is a model in many ways, right? And it's held up as a model of transitional justice. Obviously, South Africa has not a perfect place by any means, but the Truth and Reconciliation Committee and basically the ANC's decision of like, no, we're not going to seek retribution. That was an important bridge towards democracy in that case, and I think it really is a very important model for any kind of revolutionary regime.
So let me just chime in here. I mean, I think, yeah, I mean, I totally think revolutions can, you know, lead to democracy. You know, with violent origins, well, it's a little, but I think if they have sort of liberal elements, and there's also you know, I keep referring to Colin and colleagues' book, which I think is really just an excellent, you know, sort of stepping stone in this literature, has a whole section on liberalism and revolution as sort of like twin contributions of the Enlightenment. And sort of seeing them as parallel is really important because, you know, even for Marx, liberalism was seen as a revolution in itself. And so I totally think I have a hard time imagining revolutions without an illiberal revolution leading to anything other than concentration of power. But I totally think that the liberal elements of revolutions can be emphasized. And so you can have a revolution that doesn't, you know, that sets aside that incredibly, you know, attractive power of illiberal discourses and includes the ideas of pluralism. Now, there have been parts of Chavismo that have done this, but I think that's really key, and I think that's an open field. And I think, you know, Daniel Ritter has shown that, you know, in recent decades, you know, this idea, you know, liberal elements of revolutions have become key. And so, you know, violent revolutions don't have the same sort of legitimacy that they used to before. Most revolutions in recent decades have been nonviolent. And so I think, you know, there's a completely open space there to have significant radical change through electoral means. And I think, you know, we're seeing it with Donald Trump right now. It's change that I disagree with. It's, you know, a conservative sort of restoration revolution, but you know, it shows that you can actually kind of do it. The other issue on transitional justice, in the Venezuelan case I can speak of, you know, at first look, it sounds like, well, transitional justice, there's no transition. How can you talk about that? But if you actually look at cases, you know, if you just sort of set the term transition aside and think about justice for victims, it can be, even in some of the darkest circumstances, a really significant motor for transition, for sort of grasping for democracy. I mean, the case of the mothers of the Plaza de Mayo in Argentina is another way. You know, Turkey has also, you know, mothers that were very involved and important. And so there are cases in which victims fighting for justice can generate processes that can open up spaces. No, and so I think in that case, you know, transitional justice has an important role right now in Venezuela. You know, in the future, in the case of a transition, I think also there's a whole another layer that's really important, that, you know, you have an actual process of transitional justice, that you have truth commissions, that you have sort of what Guillermo Trejo has called an accountability shock, to actually have a functioning democracy afterward that's not violent. And so I think, you know, it's really important at several different levels, the idea of transitional justice.
Okay, so we can move on to our Venezuela specific question, but again, others, please feel free to jump in. So opposition figures like Maria Corina Machado have called for foreign intervention and sanctions, while Trump's deployment of naval forces near Venezuela was framed as a counter-narcotics attempt, but widely seen as political. Such actions give Maduro a pretext to intensify authoritarianism, extending repression beyond opposition leaders to intellectuals and academics. And why do you think other regional actors have held back when they might have exerted meaningful pressure?
Okay, so I guess that's me. I think what is going on right now is very unfortunate. I mean, I think what has happened. See, there's a lot of blame to go around. Basically, the government shut down these elections. Stole the election in July and August 2024, and the opposition since then Maria Corina has basically had an international strategy since then. And part of this international strategy has been putting forward this narrative that the Tren de Aragua is controlled by Nicolas Maduro and it is invading the United States. Maduro is at the head of the Cartel de los Soles, which is this drug cartel, and the Tren de Aragua is its like operational arm, and it's invading the United States. And so that has been an effort to try and generate this international intervention. Of course, that narrative is nonsense at several different levels. First of all, the cartel, there's big drug trafficking within the armed forces, but there is no cartel. That was something that was a sort of a metaphor that was created by journalists to kind of talk about the fact that journalists with that armed forces were involved in drug trafficking, but there is nothing that's called the Cartel de los Soles, or anybody that would say I'm part of the Cartel de los Soles. Doesn't exist. Tren de Aragua, no, is a gang. It's done some really nasty things, but it's, in Colombia, Peru, Chile, in the United States, very minimal. It's sort of disorganized. It's even sort of disorganized now in Venezuela. So it's all a pretext to try and get the United States to do what the opposition has not been able to do, and that is to, force Maduro from power. Now, that would be laughable, but we have a government that deals, lives and breathes conspiracy theories. Donald Trump thinks he won the 2020 election. So, of course, this is not far-fetched to adopt this idea that the Cartel of Sol is controlling the Tren de Aragua and invading the United States. And so, Donald Trump, people rightly point out that he does not like boots on the ground. He's railed against boots on the ground. So the idea of an actual invasion is not, I think, is far-fetched. What isn't, I think, far-fetched is the idea of him using air power. He actually kind of likes air power, and he's used it. He used it the first term. He used it against Iran, but his idea is to go in there, throw some bombs, and then just like let people take care of it. And that is not going to lead to a democratic outcome in Venezuela. I think this is going to intensify repression. I think that's right. No, I have a paper, or a chapter that I wrote with a former student that the basic point that we found, we tried to look at what the consequences of U.S. policy in Venezuela were. And to our surprise, we expected U.S. policy to, backfire most of the time. But what we found is that U.S. policy had very little impact in whether Nicolas Maduro liberalized or became more authoritarian. It had no distinguishing impact. The only case in which it had more impact was in 2017 when when Trump said that we have a military option in Venezuela. And in that case, he ratcheted down authoritarian measures. No, and so we're already seeing that. We're already seeing, Jorge Rodriguez, who's, I think now president of the National Assembly, warning, that any Americans that are here without permission are going to be detained. You just count on that. And so, it's not a good development. It's based on fictitious premises, but we're in a government that's what they base most things on. So.
I think we can close up with this question that's kind of stepping back a little bit and thinking kind of about the academic scholarship on revolutions. So what are a few recent advances in the study of revolutions that you see as crucial for moving scholarly and public conversations forward?
I think that's for Colin, probably.
I think there's been kind of a lot of different things that have emerged in the last 20 years. And one thing that's really important is I think we've really noticed the importance of international environments. Of course, that's my hobby horse. But the kind of lesson I think that we've learned, particularly from Chenoweth's work, and this has been noted by people working on unarmed and civil resistance strategies for a while, is that big coalitions work, right? Big coalitions, big tents, you invite everyone in. they work at overthrowing autocrats. And if you keep your coalition big, then you're more likely to be pluralist in the future. So I think that's actually something that scholars could be working more on, of like the effects of coalitions and how coalitions are made and break apart as kind of a unit of analysis. And I also think that's something that activists can think of how do you build a big coalition and how do you keep a big coalition together, particularly once the autocrat is out of power.
Great, thank you, Colin. David, Dora Maria, would you like to add anything else for us to close out? Yeah, Dora Maria, please.
Comentario, ¿no? En efecto, yo creo que de los grandes desafíos que se tiene para avanzar en una transición a la democracia está la capacidad de la oposición de juntarse en torno a un programa de transición a la democracia, y yo estoy de acuerdo con Colin. Entre más plural sea la coalición, más garantías hay de que haya una pluralidad democrática en el futuro. Pero eso es siempre un desafío, y es un desafío en América Latina, donde el hábito no es necesariamente configurar coaliciones de largo plazo, sino configurar coaliciones electorales que son frágiles, ¿verdad? Para enfrentar elecciones. Pero aún hay un problema adicional. La polarización mundial también polariza, provoca una polarización dentro de las propias oposiciones a regímenes autoritarios, porque se traslada el escenario de polarización mundial, es decir, esta oleada conservadora y el resto de sectores polarizados, que dificultan la configuración de coaliciones para enfrentarse a regímenes autoritarios. Entonces, ese sí es un gran desafío. Y el otro tiene que ver con el tema de la justicia que hablábamos antes. Justicia transicional, justicia simplemente en efecto, ¿verdad? Digamos, Ortega provocó en el año 2018, la represión de las movilizaciones del año 2018 resultó en más de 350 muertos, asesinados, ¿verdad? Y la mayor parte jóvenes. Y a la fecha llevamos por lo menos 5.000 personas que han pasado por la cárcel, más largo el tiempo o más breve el tiempo. Y un régimen represivo total en Nicaragua, es decir, la imposición de un régimen de terror. Entonces, el desafío de establecer mecanismos de justicia es clave, porque ¿quién se quiere bajar del poder si el costo es elevado, como decía Colin? Pero ¿cuál es la motivación para una transición democrática que no involucre justicia? Entonces, aquí hay un gran tema en la construcción de la justicia transicional, en el avance de la transición democrática que hay que resolver. Es decir, hay espacios internacionales, la Corte Penal Internacional, la Comisión Interamericana de Derechos Humanos, la Corte Interamericana de Derechos Humanos, pero Venezuela y Nicaragua se salieron del sistema interamericano. O el uso de la justicia universal en casos como el del crimen del mayor Roberto Sancán en Costa Rica, que es, digamos, represión transnacional ejercida por el régimen de Ortega. Es decir, la justicia no necesariamente debe esperar la transición democrática como tal, sino que puede contribuir de manera decisiva, yo estoy de acuerdo con David, a que esa transición democrática sea posible. Y esa es la lucha que han hecho las asociaciones de víctimas en el caso de Nicaragua, y que hacen distintos movimientos para garantizar que haya una denuncia sobre el tema de derechos humanos y que se busquen mecanismos alternativos, universales e internacionales, para el acceso a la justicia.
Okay, so could I have just a couple of comments?
Yes, and then I'll close us out.
Okay.
Thanks, David.
Okay. So, yeah, I mean, this whole panel is a little bit ironic because Becca in particular, for years, along with our colleague Veronica Subillaga, have been trying to push me to the concept of revolution. And I've been just like, no. It's like, it's not a revolution. And in fact, I think Becca actually snuck it into the title of our edited volume on violence. But so a couple of things have happened. One is, Becca's book, Policing the Revolution, I think Venezuela is fantastic. And I think the reason it's fantastic is that it sort of combines the great literature on violence in Latin America and the idea of violent democracies with understanding how revolutionary power can work, and it looks at decentralization, sort of the demonopolization of violence as a way a revolutionary government works. And the other thing is Colin and colleagues' book on revolutions. I think this is part of a wave of literature that's sort of really revived, or I don't know if revived, or has really sort of given a big boost to the literature on revolution, in that it's kind of opened it up to more contemporary things. Instead of just looking at violent social revolutions, they go through this book and they look at, they sort of, I've mentioned the fact that they broke down, armed versus unarmed. They also, I think, very usefully break down successful versus unsuccessful revolution, and just kind of open up the idea of revolution and radical change in a way that I think provides an alternative provides a way of deepening, like this session, our understanding of democratic erosion. Now, our focus on democratic erosion, I think, can be complemented and provided with a more sort of robust understanding by embedding it in the idea of revolution in certain cases, not in every case. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much to our panelists. This has been a very rich and illuminating conversation for me. And thank you so much to Kevin Cromash and Sue Stokes at the Chicago Center of Democracy for hosting us at the University of Chicago on this webinar. And I look forward to continuing to be in conversation. Colin, this is the first time I've had the opportunity to chat with you. I think I look forward to reading your work, and congratulations, Becca, on your new book. And thanks so much for joining us. And thank you to a very participatory audience. And we've written down the additional questions we weren't able to get to continue to chew on. So thanks so much.